have you ever looked at games you are currently playing and wondered how we came to this point? All those things that we are taking for granted today, such as advanced graphics, established genres, or even the most basic gameplay mechanics. Someone had to figure out all of this stuff first, right? PC gaming has made enormous progress in a relatively short time. Within just around 40 years, it has emerged from its niche in the academic community into a multi-billion worldwide industry. But as time goes by, fewer people remember how it all started, and history slowly fades into a distant memory. These days, most gamers are too young to have even a vague recollection about the 90s, let alone anything further in the past. And with this new documentary series, I want to preserve those memories and give you a comprehensive image of each year in PC gaming history. I read through numerous gaming magazines of the past, watched hours of archive footage, played dozens of obscure computer games, and even talked with people who were making history. To make things even more interesting for you, most of the old footage that will be shown in this episode was upscaled to HD quality with the power of the AI technology. This project is a massive undertaking that took me almost a year to make it happen, and hopefully it's only just the beginning. And now I'm going to tell you a story about games, developers and technologies that defined PC gaming and shaped it the way we know it today. In our first episode, we are going to take a deep dive into the dawn of computer gaming and take a closer look at the state of the industry by the year 1980. Today we are going to explore the following topics. The first ever digital computer game, mainframes and how they were used for entertainment, 1977 Trinity, the rise of the home computer market, Colossal Cave Adventure, the grandfather of the adventure genre, Atari and their forgotten take on microcomputers, Adventure International, adventure games comes to the micros, Ken and Roberto Williams establish online systems, Zork, the first blockbuster of the computer gaming industry. This and much more you'll see on this edition of PC Gaming Chronicles. Although the primary focus of this episode is going to be the events of the late 70s, before we proceed we have to look a little further back in time. As you may have guessed, the PC gaming industry wasn't created overnight in 1980. Since I've decided to make this documentary series in a year-apart manner, one of the biggest challenges was finding the best starting point for our journey. There are a lot of important events in the backstory of PC gaming, but their density on the timeline was relatively low at the beginning. One of such important events that I wanted to pinpoint was the first video game ever made. But apparently there was no simple answer to that question, and the problem lies in the definition of a video game. The earliest known electronic game was filed for a patent in 1947 and was called Cathode Ray Tube Amusement Device. It was a simplistic game in which you were trying to hit the target that was painted on a transparent overlay placed on the cathode ray tube or CRT display. The reason why this device is rarely considered as the true progenitor of modern video games is the fact that it was built on a purely analog hardware, and most importantly, this device was never manufactured or at least shown to the general public, and thus it had little to no impact on the future of the video gaming industry. In the following years, several engineers around the globe independently created their own electronic games, such as Bertie the Brain in Canada or Nimrod in the UK. But since we are talking about computer gaming history, I was looking specifically for the first game that wasn't tied to custom-built hardware. And perhaps the first such game would be OXO. Created by Alexander Shafter Douglas in 1952, it was a digital recreation of a tic-tac-toe paper and pencil game. Developed for academic purposes, it was one of the earliest examples of an AI opponent, which perhaps is making it the first ever single-player game. OXO was also the first graphical digital game. It used one of the CRT displays of the computer to convey the current state of the game's board. The game was running on EDSAC, one of the earliest British mainframe computers. This machine was constructed from dozens of vacuum tubes and occupied an entire room at Cambridge University. To play OXO, the player had to input the number of a square he wanted to occupy via the mainframe's rotary dial. I wonder how many of you guys even know how to use such an input device. This emulator is not quite accurate in this regard, even though I appreciate the sound. Anyway, since OXO was a software-based game stored on a punched tape, technically it could have been shared across multiple computer installations. Unfortunately, back in the early 50s, most computers like EDSAC were one-of-a-kind devices, available only in a few universities and government facilities around the world. So, although the historical significance of Douglas' creation is undeniable, due to the lack of public access to his game, it was almost completely overlooked at the time. For the next decade, computer games remained in the prerogative of the academic community, most of which didn't see any value in software that was made purely for entertainment. Another thing that didn't change over time was the love of computer scientists to tic-tac-toe. Its endless digital conversions were one of the most common benchmarks of the early computers.
For myself, computer gaming actually starts way back in the 60s, in 1965-ish, and I was playing on an IBM mainframe. Where was I? I was at the New York World's Fair. IBM had a pavilion there, and they had a computer game, and I gravitated right towards it. There was a long line, and the game is tic-tac-toe. That's the 9 squares with X and O's, and you were playing against the computer, and next to it was a big sign that would light up, you lose, and then another sign that pops up, says tie, and then I asked them, where's the sign that says I won? And they said, don't worry, you'll never be able to beat the computer. So I proceeded to play the game, and I thought about that for a long time. Why couldn't the computer be beaten? And found that fascinating. But that was the very first computer game I've ever seen. And maybe one of the first ever seen by a large number of the public.
Computing technologies continued to rapidly evolve over the 50s, making several major technological leaps, such as the shift from vacuum tubes to transistors. As a result, a new class of computing devices, known as mini-computers, has emerged on the market. But what was considered mini in those days bears little resemblance to what we call a small computer today. Although they were still occupying a lot of space, those machines were designed with the cost taken in consideration, making them more accessible to the public. But despite the significant price reduction, it was still too early for computers to conquer the mass market. Until the late 60s, the reach of mini-computers was limited mainly to universities and big corporations who could afford to pay thousands of dollars to get one of such machines. As more people were getting possession of the divine powers of programming, it was only a matter of time until someone would have used computers for something more fun than scientific research and financial calculations. And that man was Steve Russell, a young student of MIT. In 1961, he created Space War, a game that will influence several generations of aspiring game developers.
Now you should be in a stable orbit. Yep. And now you can concentrate. Oh, you got done in by an asteroid.
Written for the PDP-1 minicomputer, it was a space combat game in which two ships were fighting each other in a gravity well. It was a product of the emerging hacker culture, which is a topic that is worthy of a separate documentary. To not overwhelm you with details, I'll just clarify that back in the 60s, the word hacker didn't have such a controversial meaning as it has now. Back then, it was used to describe a person who enjoys the intellectual challenge of creatively overcoming the limitations of programming systems. Originally being made to showcase the real-time graphical capabilities of PDP-1, Space War ended up being much more than that, thanks to the contributions from the fellow hackers. The source code of Space War was a public domain, freely shared and modified by other computer enthusiasts, which makes it the first ever open source game with an active modding community. Each contributor was changing and improving different aspects of Space War, like adding the accurate star field on the background or even building custom hardware just for the sake of this game. Playing Space War by flicking toggle switches on PDP-1's control panel was a rather painful experience. So Alan Kotak and Bob Saunders came up with the first ever gamepad prototype, which tremendously improved the user experience. Over the next few decades, dozens of ports and variations of Space War were created, featuring new gameplay mechanics and other enhancements. By the way, in case you didn't know, you can play one of the latest iterations of this game right now on Steam. It was added by Valve as a testing tool of Steamworks functionality to developers, but you can still give it a try as long as you can find someone to play with you. Space War has become an obsession for several generations of computer enthusiasts and was the first of its kind to gain widespread recognition. There was nothing like that before. The gameplay held the perfect balance between the simplicity of its rules and the complex gravity simulation, offering a surprising amount of depth for such rudimentary software. As if this wasn't enough for the list of achievements that Space War rightfully gained, it's also responsible for making a foundation for an entire esports scene. The world's first official video game tournament occurred at Stanford University in October 1972, and Space War was its main discipline. Organized by the editor of Rolling Stone magazine Stuart Brand, this event was called the first Intergalactic Space War Olympics. The grand prize went to Bruce Baumgart, who received a year's subscription to Rolling Stone magazine and the title of the first ever esports champion. So although these days Space War is largely unknown to the public, its influence on the gaming industry as a whole cannot be understated. It was the first to show that fun could be a driving force in the advancement of computer technology and made a foundation for an entire video gaming industry.
The concept of an interactive computer was strange. Some people thought it was wrong, almost spoke in ethical terms. Computer is serious, you shouldn't treat it lightly, you shouldn't have fun with it, it shouldn't be exciting, it should be formal and distant with red tape involved. And you had dozens of bright people spending all hours of the day studying this. And out of this came what we know of today as video games.
Despite the tremendous success of Space War, for the rest of the decade, the majority of other existing computer games remained isolated in the academic communities in which they were created. Dozens of early mainframe games ended up being largely forgotten even before the creation of the commercial gaming industry. One of such pieces of software which could have been lost to history was the Sumerian game. It's important for our overview because it was perhaps the first ever strategy video game based on the original concept. Designed by Mabel Edis and programmed by William McKay, it was a text-based edutainment game intended to teach basic economic theory in the context of the history of Sumerian civilization. And thanks to the efforts of Mabel Edis in adding a strong narrative component to the game, it was more than just a resource management simulation. Instead of simply bombarding the player with boring numbers and stats, the computer was playing the role of a steward who was delivering reports on the state of your kingdom. Additional audiovisual elements, such as imagery slideshow and taped audio lectures, help to prove that the Sumerian game can be considered the first ever narrative game as we know them today. Unfortunately, despite several playtests and public demonstrations, this project was eventually abandoned because of the lack of funding. The Sumerian game could have been gone forever if not for an unusual set of circumstances. In 1968, Doug Diamond was given a talk at the university in Alberta about computers in education. He was an employee of Digital Equipment Corporation, also known as DEC, which was a major player in the emerging mini-computer market. By a lucky coincidence, one of the students who attended his speech was a playtester of the Cimmerian game. After the lecture, they approached Diamond and described the concept of the game. Inspired by what he heard, Diamond recreated the game for PDP minicomputers, only with a stripped-down narrative part due to memory limits. Thanks to his decision, the Cimmerian game legacy continued through numerous ports and conversions that later became known as Hammurabi. Worth noting that there is a common misconception that the player was taking the role of the king of ancient Sumeria with a similar name, but in fact, in Diamond's remake, Hammurabi was the name of the steward, and this strange decision still confuses players and gaming historians to this day. The educational field has become the major driving force in the growing popularity of digital gaming. Of course, it wasn't in the original intentions of most computer scientists. They were mostly trying to improve learning productivity and didn't care about such silly things as games. But it couldn't be helped. No matter what they were trying to invent, students were always finding a way to use it for entertainment instead of studying. One of such inventions of the 60s that turned into one of the most important singular sources of gaming innovations was Plato, an educational network system developed at the University of Illinois by Donald Bitzer. Originally designed to deliver lessons to students, it ended up being used to host dozens of multiplayer games that became the most popular courses on the platform. Vehicle and space combat simulations, role-playing games, turn-based strategies, top-down and first-person shooters, even a goddamn free cell, Plato had them all. However, most of these games were created only in the 70s after the introduction of the Plato 4, which was manufactured as a commercial product.
The net result is you had basically a graphics terminal that was just head and shoulders above anything else. You know, it wasn't until the late 80s that this sort of quality became available, say, on a home computer. Plato was the first place where multiplayer games where people scattered all over the country could play the same game, either cooperating or competing, really happened on any scale and was available and visible to a lot of people, especially impressionable college students like myself.
The list of innovations of Plato goes far beyond gaming, introducing the world to plasma displays, touchscreens, emails, chat rooms, and many other things. Despite making such an impact on the computer industry, Plato is almost completely forgotten at this point, and this is yet another topic that is worthy of separate in-depth research. So many ideas, so little time. Although the 60s marked a lot of significant events for video gaming history, the path to creating a commercial industry was still hindered by difficulties in sharing software. The wide area networking was still years away, and the Plato system reached its peak only in the next decade. Floppy disks became commercially available for the mass consumer only in 1971, so the only removable data storage available at the time were punched cards and tapes, which were easily getting damaged. In most cases, you had listings printed or even handwritten on paper, so each time you wanted to use a program, you had to type in its entire source code, and God forbid you from making a typo at line 75. But the worst thing of all was the lack of backward compatibility. Back then, the computer market was like the Wild West in this regard. To make the program run on different computers, you often had to modify or even completely rewrite its code. And back in the 60s, very few people were knowledgeable enough to do something like that. Computer scientists had to look for ways to remove this obstacle and promote computer literacy for people without an academic degree. And so, they eventually came out with something basic. Even though the computer revolution began only in the middle of the 70s, one of the keys to its success predates it by almost a decade. Invented in 1964 by John Kameny and Thomas Kurtz, Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, or simply BASIC, was not the first ever high-level programming language, but unlike the other languages of that era, such as Fortran and Algol, its syntax comprised common words and had a more or less obvious meaning.
Look, the machine doesn't understand English. It only understands a simple language called BASIC that has a simple English-like vocabulary. But also the machine is pretty dumb.
Yeah.
Thanks to such a straightforward approach, BASIC didn't require weeks and weeks of training to learn how to use it. Although it wasn't some magical solution that made all the code work on every machine without any modifications, it definitely made things a lot easier. This relative simplicity and low memory requirements helped BASIC to become the programming language of the early days of the home computing industry. And gaming played a significant role in introducing more people to programming and computers. By the early 70s, big players such as DEC couldn't ignore how quickly BASIC was gaining the favor of the computer enthusiasts. Despite having their own solutions such as Focal, it was clear that BASIC was becoming an important selling point for all kinds of computers. In order to not lose the market share, DEC adopted BASIC on their machines and assigned David Ahl to make a demonstration of the language on their PDP minicomputers. The result of his work was ports of several mainframe programs to BASIC, and one of them was an enhanced version of Hammurabi, the remake of the Sumerian game that we've talked about in the previous chapter. Another game that he converted to BASIC was the text version of Lunar Lander, which spawned an entire subgenre of physics-based simulators. Noticing the popularity of his game ports, David made a call for reader submissions in a DEC newsletter that he was editing. It's worth noting that publishing a newsletter was a pretty common practice for computer companies of that era, and even game developers of the 80s were often doing this. Anyway, the reader's response was overwhelming, and soon David was flooded with all kinds of games. After giving a thought about what to do with all that treasure, he approached DEC higher-ups with an unusual request. He wanted to publish an anthology with listings of the most interesting games from his growing collection. It's not like DEC wasn't publishing such books before, but dedicating an entire anthology to programs made for fun. That was something unseen before, but nevertheless, the leadership accepted David's request. The book saw the light of the day in 1973 and was known as 101 Basic Computer Games. Within a few years, it sold over 10,000 copies, which was far more than there were computers in existence at the time. Games like Star Trek, Civil War, Hammurabi, and others listed in the book had a lasting impact on the whole gaming industry. Many people used it as a reference manual to learn BASIC and even write their language interpreters. One of such developers was Steve Wozniak, one of the co-founders of Apple. He later admitted that this book was one of his Bibles that he used to learn the language and developed Integer BASIC for Apple II. After leaving DEC, David Ahl kept the rights on the book and later republished it with the contents updated for the emerging home computer market. Basic Computer Games was translated into 6 languages and ended up becoming the first computer book to sell more than 1 million copies. In the wake of its success, David Ahl continued his efforts in the educational field and established Creative Computing, one of the earliest magazines focused on everything related to personal computer culture. The contribution of David is often overlooked, but he is without a doubt one of the most influential figures of the early days of the home computer industry. Basic Computer Games and Creative Computing introduced thousands of people to the world of computing, inspiring them to learn how to program and design their own games. While more and more people were learning how to write software, computer hardware continued to rapidly evolve. One of the most important milestones in the history of the entire electronics industry was the creation of Intel 4004, the first commercially produced microprocessor that debuted on the market in 1971. although this 4-bit CPU wasn't powerful enough to be used in computers, it marked a shift to more compact and cheaper computing devices. Just within a year, it was followed by the 8008, the world's first 8-bit microprocessor. But Intel's first real commercial success came in 1974 with the introduction of the 8080, the CPU that was almost 10 times faster than its predecessor. Such an unprecedented power helped this chip to find its way into thousands of electronic devices and allowed the creation of the entire home computer industry. The era of home computing had officially begun in 1975 when an American electronics manufacturer, MITS, released Altair 8800, the first commercially successful microcomputer. It was an unusual product for a company mainly focused on selling calculators, but the brutal competition in this industry put it on the verge of bankruptcy. Ed Roberts, the founder of MITS, decided to pioneer an entirely new market as the last-ditch effort to save his company. To make this project happen, he worked out a deal with Intel that supplied him with their latest 8080 CPUs. The result of this partnership was a strange-looking metal box with lights and switches on the front panel that didn't include any display or even a keyboard. This computer has been sold as a kit that you had to build on your own, but for an additional price you could get the assembled machine. The plan was to sell a few hundred of Altair 8800 in a year, but within a month after it was officially announced, MITS were getting around 200 orders daily, beating the wildest estimations. Not even MITS themselves had a clear image of what you could really do with that thing after you assembled it. But just the idea of having your very own personal computer was more than enough to thrill the minds of dozens of enthusiasts around the country. Altair 8800 drew its users to experiment and find what it's really capable of, and soon enough they found a way to do something useful with that weird box. As expected for the first of its kind, Altair 8800 was incredibly tedious to use. To give commands to this computer, you had to use switches on the front panel, and this process was taking a ridiculous amount of time, even for the most trivial tasks. The solution to this problem was to bring an actual programming language to the machine, so users could type their codes rather than flipping switches. And this is where Microsoft came to play with their founding product, Altair Basic. A few months after the launch of Altair 8800, Bill Gates and Paul Allen recognized its potential and developed a compact version of the BASIC interpreter for this device. This incredible piece of software allowed people to attach terminals to Altair 8800 and use it for writing their own programs for all kinds of purposes, from business and science tasks to, of course, gaming. And just like that, the entire new industry has been created, with dozens of new software and hardware companies popping up like mushrooms after a rainy day. Unfortunately for MITS, they didn't manage to stay competitive for long. In 1977, the company was sold with all of its assets, and Ed Roberts retired from the computer industry. But for Microsoft, it was only the beginning, as they became one of the leaders of the PC revolution.
We didn't want to have a single product that was a dominant product. We wanted to hire in more software people and have a full product line. In a sense, one of the earliest things we decided to do was to make available on the microprocessor everything that had been available on the mini computer. And that's why we did the languages, COBOL, assembler, all the normal tools that you would expect to be able to do native software development.
Of course, all those events have greatly benefited computer gaming as well. Enthusiasts were no longer restricted to academic institutions and could let their creativity run wild. But there was still a lot of technical boundaries in place, so the majority of computer games remained predominantly text-oriented for quite a while. The software distribution also remained complicated due to the lack of reliable and cheap data storage. To help software hobbyists to reach a wider audience, the early computer magazines such as Compute and Creative Computing often dedicated much of their pages to readers' submissions written in BASIC and other languages. But that initiative didn't last for long because software continued to grow in complexity and quickly began to consist of thousands of lines of code. Typing such long listings could have taken hours, even for proficient computer users, not to mention that there was still a good chance of making typos. But it was an important first step towards the creation of the commercial software industry. BASIC introduced the world of computing to the masses and turned a strange piece of electronics into something desired by both enthusiasts and business enterprises. For the next decade, this programming language remained to be one of the fundamental parts of the home computing industry. But despite being so useful in establishing a new market, BASIC was not the most scalable solution compared to its competitors. And the truth is, no matter how easy it was to learn how to program, an average mass consumer didn't want to deal with the code. Computer manufacturers and developers quickly realized that, so the next big trend in the industry was creating a more user-friendly experience that didn't involve any programming. And with the rise of more powerful commercial software that featured graphical user interfaces, BASIC has eventually lost its influence over the market. As for Microsoft, they continued to expand and adapt the code of Altair BASIC for a wide range of early microcomputers, while demand was high. At first, it was mainly clones of Altair 8800, such as IMSI 8080 and Poly 88. But shortly after, three new ambitious challenges entered the battle for dominance in this new frontier. The home computer revolution was about to begin. The same year when the company that kickstarted the home computer industry had gone for good, a new wave of microcomputers hit the market with considerable fanfare. These three influential machines, later collectively referred to as the 9077 Trinity, were TRS-80 by Tandy Corporation, Commodore PET, and Apple II. Unlike Altair 8800, these computers were first and foremost aimed at the mass market rather than hobbyists. Instead of a menacing box with confusing lights and switches, a consumer was getting an assembled and presentable-looking machine. Curiously enough, none of those computers used Intel CPUs and instead relied on their lower-priced competitors. The use of Zilog Z80 microprocessor was reflected in the TRS-80's name, while Apple II and Commodore PET were built around MOS Technology 6502. Those two CPUs and their iterations were later widely used in many other home computers of the 80s and became the de facto standard of the 8-bit era. Despite having similarities in terms of features and hardware, 9077 Trinity were substantially different from each other. I won't make a detailed technical comparison of those machines, but they had one thing in common: none of them were really suitable for gaming yet. Among the Trinity, Apple II was the only one capable of displaying color graphics. As funny as it may sound now, Apple was also offering incredible flexibility and openness for expansion possibilities that was unmatched by competitors at the time. But such a sophisticated design came at the price. In its cheapest package with only 4 kilobytes of memory, Apple II had cost over $1,000, and the memory expansions and other essential peripherals could have easily doubled the original price of this computer. On the other hand, TRS-80 wasn't as well designed, but it was available for a much cheaper price in a wide range of different configurations. Commodore PET was somewhere in the middle between those two, and offered the most complete package for a reasonable cost. Built in a stylish metal case with an integrated monitor and tape cassette drive, it was giving a buyer everything they needed to start working right after the purchase. But on the downside, Commodore PET lacked any expansion slots and didn't support bitmapped graphics at all. Technically, you could buy TRS-80 and Commodore PET for just around $500, But just like in the case of Apple II, these very basic 4KB configurations were barely usable without additional investments. The absolute majority of available software, and especially games, required at least 16K memory, so the real price of those computers was starting from around $800. For years, memory limitations would remain to be the bane of the home computer industry, making it the most important technical number that users had to know about their machine. Since none of the Trinity included hard drives, users had to rely heavily on external data storage devices. While paper tapes and type-in listings were still commonly used, they finally started to get replaced with more convenient options. In the late 70s, floppy disk drives were still too expensive and rare, so at first the most common computer storage device was a magnetic tape cassette. Yeah, imagine that, they were used not just for the music, although I'm not sure how many of you ever had to deal with cassette players at all. Anyway, magnetic tapes could store thousands of kilobytes of data, but on the downside they were infamously slow. As the complexity of computer software was rapidly increasing, the loading routines for sophisticated programs could have taken over 15 minutes in some cases. Think about it next time you'll complain about loading times.
Some of the tape systems on some of the early micros were not very accurate. And you might get 90% into something that says read error, and you literally had to rewind and start over. No error recovery at all. So 15 minutes is probably not an exaggeration. It was slow, but we were happy to have it. It sure beat having to type everything in all over again from scratch.
In the early days of the industry, 9077 Trinity defined magnetic tapes as the primary data storage of microcomputers. Cassettes opened up a convenient way for developers to share their creations with fellow enthusiasts and made it possible to have a commercial software industry. Eventually, tapes were replaced with floppy disks, but the pace of this transition heavily depended on the region. In the United States, it happened rather quickly thanks to the efforts of Apple, but cassettes remained actively used as data storage devices in Europe and other parts of the world until the late 80s. In specific cases, like in post-Soviet countries, they stayed relevant even longer due to numerous ZX Spectrum clones that appeared after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But for the rest of the 70s, a tape recorder remained to be an essential accessory for a microcomputer. Now, before we proceed, let's take a little quiz. Take a guess, which of 9077 Trinity computers sold the most by the end of the decade? Well, I wouldn't be surprised if you think that it was an Apple II. After all, their competitors went out of business ages ago, and none of them would argue otherwise. Although it didn't stop Steve Jobs from insisting on the same thing, even when his rivals were still around on the market.
Because Apple II went on to be the largest selling computer in the history of the world, and still is.
But despite the image of complete dominance that Apple was trying to create all the time, for the rest of the decade they were in last place among the Trinity. In terms of sales, the actual leader of that era was Tandy Corporation with their TRS-80, which by the end of the 70s had over 50% of the entire home computer market. By the end of the TRS-80's life cycle, it sold over 2,400,000 units, outselling the original Apple II by a factor of 5. In comparison, Commodore PET sold almost 200,000 units by 1980, gaining a second place among the Trinity. But to be fair, TRS-80 computers had another important advantage, along with the low price tag. Unlike the rest of the Trinity, it was backed by the whole marketing power of Radio Shack, an electronics retailing giant that was promoting and selling those computers through their chain stores.
One summer when I got home, I found that there was like one Radio Shack. It wasn't even a Radio Shack store. It was like a little hardware store that had a little Radio Shack corner in it in my town. And they had one of these TRS-80s, and they had no idea how to do it. They could barely even turn it on. And they didn't want anything to do with it. And so they basically gave it to me at like almost their cost, just so that they could tell their, the Radio Shack people, yeah, we sold it.
So while hardcore enthusiasts were pursuing an expensive Apple II, the average consumer was usually going to the local store and buying TRS-80. Commodore found itself in a weird spot between those two, but they've managed to find a niche for PET in the educational field. In the end, all three machines played their own role in establishing the PC market. A powerful Apple II pushed developers to create complex and innovative games, while for many people, TRS-80 and Commodore PET became their introduction to the world of computing. Some may argue that their contribution was not equal, but I believe that all those machines from 1977 Trinity equally deserve our recognition. But creating well-designed hardware or having great marketing power is not the only thing that you need in order to achieve long-term success. Computer manufacturers quickly realized that without great software their products would be useless, and Apple got tremendously lucky in this regard. In 1979, Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston released a product that suddenly made Apple II desired by many. VisiCalc is widely acknowledged as the first ever killer app, and it wasn't a game, but a spreadsheet. Still, this program is important for our story because it tremendously accelerated the growth of the entire software industry. Curiously enough, initially VisiCalc hasn't been planned as an Apple II exclusive. Developers simply didn't have access to other machines to port it on them as well. Meanwhile, people were willing to spend thousands of dollars just to get the computer that could run VisiCalc, and thanks to this unexpected twist of fate, Apple managed to turn things around and has become a serious contender in the fight for the appeal of mass-market consumers. As for the fate of the rest of the Trinity, after a short period of success, the popularity of these computers had quickly begun to wind down. The original TRS-80 received several revisions and ended up leaving a significant mark in the history of the home computer industry. But despite producing the latest model in the TRS-80 line until the early 90s, Tandy Corporation failed to keep up the momentum and eventually switched their focus toward producing IBM PC-compatible systems. On the other hand, the fate of Commodore was completely opposite. Recognizing the gradual decline in the sales of PET, they've managed to come up quickly with a new solution. Learning from their mistakes, in 1981, Commodore released VIC-20, which was cheaper and yet more powerful than its predecessor. Offering color graphics and decent sound capabilities for just around $300, VIC-20 was bound to immediate success. It didn't make a bigger impact on the gaming industry only because it was quickly succeeded by even more powerful and popular computer in Commodore's line. But that's another story, and we'll explore this topic in detail in one of our next episodes of PC Gaming Chronicles. Just like in the case of Altair 8800, the success of 1977 Trinity brought attention to other companies who realized the potential of this booming industry. Some manufacturers came up with unique takes on microcomputer design, while others tried to make a bank on clones of the biggest players on the market. Apple II was the most frequently copied home computer among the Trinity, with dozens of clones selling around the globe. As you can imagine, Apple didn't like that and relentlessly battled such competition in courts. While they successfully shut down Apple II clone sales in the United States, they couldn't do much to stop manufacturers in other parts of the world. But even if we would exclude all clones from our list, by the mid-80s there were at least 100 different microcomputers available on the market. Very few of them actually made any significant impact on the computer gaming industry, so I'm not going to mention every single one of them in those series. But there were several interesting cases that are worth giving our attention, and one of them was Atari. Since this documentary is focused on computer gaming history, I deliberately didn't go into detail about what was happening at the other end of the gaming spectrum. But I don't want to give you the wrong impression that the whole gaming industry revolved around computers, so I'm going to briefly touch upon this topic. Along with the home computer market, the 70s marked the birth of the arcade and console gaming industries. One of the most prominent figures of both of those markets was Atari. Founded by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney in 1972, this company created Pong, the first ever commercially successful video game. Then, in 1977, they launched the Atari 2600 home console, which by all means became one of the most influential gaming devices ever made. Atari was also the place where many prominent computer developers began their career, including Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, the founders of Apple. But these days, very few people remember that Atari wasn't just an arcade and console game developer. At some point, they've tried to venture into the home computer market as well. Noticing the success of the 1977 Trinity, Atari's management decided to tackle this burgeoning new industry and tasked the engineering team to create a business computer. But designing a home computer was not quite the same as creating a game console. For starters, you needed a full-fledged operating system for such a machine. Nobody at Atari had experience in this field, but instead of outsourcing this job, management made a bizarre decision to develop the OS for those computers internally. So instead of making games, the most talented designers in the company spent almost 8 months working on something completely unrelated to their expertise. And that happened just when Atari 2600 entered the market and desperately needed quality games to attract the audience. Frustrated at being forced on the project they had no interest in, the development team decided to do what they were doing best. Without telling management, instead of making a business computer, they were focused on creating an advanced gaming machine.
We ended up having to throw the entire company at it to try to get it out to market, which included all of us who were making successful games stopped working on games, which was stupid, and helped make the operating system for the Atari 800. But in doing that, we made the operating system be more helpful to making games than doing business software.
The fruits of Atari's engineers' labor were Atari 400 and 800, a family of 8-bit home computers debuted in 1979. Since those machines were made with gaming in mind, they were superior in audio and visual capabilities to anything else available on the microcomputer market. It was all thanks to the innovative design that revolved around custom coprocessor chips, something that was never done before in the home computer industry. Those custom chips were dedicated for graphics and sound, offloading the burden from CPU and significantly increasing its processing power. Surprisingly, despite the noticeable price difference between the 400 and 800 models, they had largely similar specifications. Atari 400 was a low-end computer with 8K or 16K memory for $550. This model had an awkward membrane keyboard and limited expandability options, but the rest of its hardware was mostly identical to the 800 line. For an additional $450, you could get more memory, a full travel keyboard, and a few extra expansion slots and ports. But in general, the 400 and 800 models could run the same utilities and games, so it was just a matter of convenience. Developers gladly used such power to create games that were on par with their arcade relatives, or even surpassed them in some cases. One of such examples was Star Raiders, a first-person space combat simulator that was far ahead of its time. Inspired by recent movie blockbuster Star Wars, in 1979 Doug Neubauer developed a groundbreaking real-time 3D experience with surprisingly complex gameplay for its time. The player was taking control over the hyperspace ship and had to protect his homeland from an invading alien fleet. Navigating through the two-dimensional galactic chart, the main goal was to intercept enemy ships from attacking starbases around the map. Those bases were used by the player to resupply and repair the ship after battles, so it was crucial to defend them. Even on the galactic map, the simulation never stopped, so the player could observe enemy movements and plan his next attack. At any moment, the player could switch to the first-person view to steer his ship into hyperspace or engage in combat. Star Raiders raised the bar of gameplay and visuals quality in video games, and for many people, it became the main reason to buy an Atari computer. It had a long-lasting influence on the whole space simulators genre, defining its crucial elements and inspiring dozens of spiritual successors, such as Wing Commander, Elite, and Star Wars X-Wing. Atari 8-bit home computers had cutting-edge hardware and a vast library of high-quality games, including such system sellers as Star Raiders. It looks like they had a lot of potential, so you may ask why those computers are almost completely forgotten at this point. Well, there were a lot of reasons for such an unfortunate fate, and one of them was greed. Atari was a fun place to work, but at some point Nolan Bushnell decided to sell the company to Warner Communications to get more funds. The new management quickly ousted Bushnell from the company he created and turned Atari into a soulless corporate hellscape. So despite making games that were making millions, neither Doug Neubauer nor any other programmer in Atari received any royalties, or at least were acknowledged for their work. In fact, the salaries in Atari were significantly lower compared to other jobs in Silicon Valley. After the work on the Atari 8-bit computers was done, a group of game designers that were disgruntled with their situation decided to approach the management. They've tried to negotiate better working conditions for the entire programming team, but the corporate higher-ups refused to listen to their demands. Shortly after, this group of designers left Atari to form Activision, a company that would eventually become one of the largest third-party game publishers in the world.
So it turns out that there were 4 of us at Atari who were responsible for all of Atari's hits, or most of them at least. And one year, our games made Atari $60 million, and we were making $20,000 salaries. When the president of Atari told us that we were no more important to him than the person on the assembly line putting the games together, we knew there was no future for us at Atari. So we contacted an attorney at one of the biggest law firms in the area. So through that attorney, we met Jim Levy and spent a couple months working out whether we liked working together, working out a business plan. And we ended up with a business plan that he took to the venture capital company and got funded. So Activision, yes, Activision required funding in order to become a big publisher, but it wasn't necessarily the direction we're going to go. In hindsight, of course, it was a good decision.
Atari was bleeding talent, but it shouldn't have been a big problem. After all, the majority of computer manufacturers did well without any first-party software. But the Atari's management had a fundamental misunderstanding of the market they wanted to enter. Instead of welcoming third-party developers with open arms and allowing them to do anything they want with those computers, Atari was doing the complete opposite. The corporate management was obsessed with the control over their platform and the delivery medium for it. Atari refused to provide detailed technical specifications of their computers, or at least give instructions on how to work with their custom chips. To make things worse, they even threatened to sue anyone who would dare to publish software on Atari 8-bit computers without their permission. Unsurprisingly, very few developers bothered to go through all this trouble just to be able to make software for Atari computers, let alone creating exclusives that would fully utilize the potential of the hardware. Such a short-sighted decision hindered the growth of the platform, proving once again that without good software, even state-of-the-art hardware wasn't bound to success. Atari would soon realize their mistake and try to fix this issue, but it was a little too late for them to turn the tides. The final nail in the coffin of the future of those computers was the increasing success of Atari 2600. Although this console was released in 1977, It wasn't breaking any records in terms of sales at first. It all changed in 1980 when Atari released an official conversion of Space Invaders, one of the most influential video games of all time. Its release doubled Atari 2600 sales, and then they doubled again next year. By the end of 1982, Atari sold a staggering 15 million consoles, with dozens of cartridges often selling over 1 million units. Those were unprecedented figures for the gaming industry back then, especially compared to the home computer market. It doesn't mean that the Atari 8-bit family was selling bad. In 5 years, they reached a respectable 2 million units sold, making it one of the best-selling computer lines ever made. But it was simply not as amazing as the results of Atari 2600, so management quickly lost interest in the project that they asked to do. It wasn't the final computer made under Atari's brand, but that's another story that I hope I'll have a chance to tell you someday. Despite all the enthusiasm around microcomputers in the late 70s, the commercial software market didn't appear overnight once these machines became available in stores. Even the idea of selling software was still a novelty for many developers, so the first thing that they had to do was to figure out how to effectively reach potential customers. That's when the first software publishers began to appear. Some of those companies operated under labels of computer magazines of that era, such as SoftSide and Creative Computing. Those early publishing companies could operate thanks to the rise of magnetic tapes as a standard data storage of microcomputers. Instead of typing a listing from the magazine manually, readers could now order a cassette with the program and just load it with a simple command. Worth noting that despite allowing magazines to sell their software, developers could still freely distribute it on their own. This initiative helped to establish a commercial software market and launched the careers of many prominent game developers.
The original additional publisher for the game was David All, Creative Computing Magazine. He approached me wanting to publish the game under their label, Creative Computing Software. So I talked to David and he says, "Oh yeah, no problem, we can take the exclusive off." That was a pivotal turning point, because if I had given David exclusive rights to that game, things would have worked out incredibly different. So I'm very grateful for that impetus to go in a different direction than what I had done.
Meanwhile, the microcomputer market was growing rapidly, and soon there were thousands of customers who desperately needed software for their new toys. So despite small memory size, slow speed of storage, unimpressive graphics capabilities, and other technical limitations, dozens of developers raced to write all kinds of programs to fill this new market. Most of this early commercial software was primitive, to put it lightly, but consumers didn't have many options to choose from, so demand remained high for some time. The prospects of the commercial software industry were sure enticing, but doing business in such an exponential fashion was sustainable only due to the lack of competition and relatively low development costs. For several years, developers enjoyed hefty profits that they could generate by selling a simple quiz game or digital checkbook. That was one of the benefits of such an immature market, but it would eventually lead to its first collapse in the mid-80s. It doesn't mean that all developers and publishers of that era only cared about making a quick buck, but creating something more sophisticated than yet another tic-tac-toe conversion on such technically limited machines was not a trivial task. And since the majority of big software companies were established only in the late 70s, it took some time before they began to publish their first products. Of course, there were several exceptions from the rule, and I'm going to note them shortly. But in general, most of the computer gaming innovations of this decade came from the place where it all started, the mainframes. When microcomputers had only begun their fight for the favor of the mass consumer, mainframes already had an established community of passionate enthusiasts. All those college students of the 60s who played Space War and other games found their first jobs and thought about doing something fun with their work machines. and sometimes they were using the most unexpected hardware for that purpose.
I literally got permission to turn a multi-million-dollar radar station in its off hours into a Star Trek computer game. Because of what I had done for the company at that point, they were so grateful that they let me do that.
Another important factor that accelerated the growth of the mainframe gaming scene was the creation of the first wide area network, known as ARPANET. Its main purpose was to connect military facilities and universities around the United States and help researchers all over the country to communicate with each other. But, as it usually happens, while doing their more purposive work, people also didn't miss a chance to find ways to use this new technology for their own leisure. At first, using ARPANET for personal reasons was strictly prohibited, but as the number of institutions connected to the network has grown over the decade, the rules were also getting less strict. The creation of ARPANET was the turning point for the open source and free software movements when they became more conscious and better organized. This network removed the obstacle of unreliable data storage and allowed creators to easily share their code and ideas with other enthusiasts. And as you may have expected, games have eventually become one of the largest categories of community-shared programs on ARPANET. If I'll try to go into detail about every single influential mainframe game of the 70s, I would never finish this episode. To name a few, Empire was an early example of a turn-based wargame and also became the first to incorporate the Fog of War feature. Multi-user Dungeon has spawned an entire genre with the same name that later evolved into modern MMORPGs. Hunt the Wampus offered the player the thrill of hunting a monster in a pitch-dark cave while avoiding hazards and carrying a limited amount of ammo, perhaps making it an early example of a survival horror game. Almost 20 years before Doom, Maze War was the first-person shooter in 3D perspective with a level editor and client-server multiplayer support. The Oregon Trail was perhaps the most influential educational game before Minecraft, and I hope we'll talk in detail about its graphical ports someday. Most of these games eventually made their way from mainframes to the commercial market, where they gained even wider recognition for their innovations. But without a doubt, the most influential mainframe game of the 70s was Colossal Cave Adventure, also known as Advent. It was a text-based adventure game written by Will Crowder in 1976 for PDP-10 mainframes, and later expanded by Don Woods in 1977. The player's goal was to explore a mysterious cave full of puzzles and treasures. All navigation and other actions in the game were done by typing two-word commands like Go West or Take Keys. Colossal Cave Adventure acted as a narrator, telling a surprisingly well-written story and providing the level of interactivity that very few games could offer back then. This experience was so addicting, it became infamous in the mainframe community because instead of doing their job, many people spent days and even weeks on playing Adventure.
That's when I discovered Colossal Caves. And somebody showed it to me. I got to play for 15 minutes. I thought that's cool, went back to work. And then for the next week, every morning I would come in a couple hours early before work and stay a little bit after work and then take a lunch break. And all I was doing was playing Colossal Caves.
Colossal Cave wasn't just the progenitor of all adventure games. Its ideas have been used as a foundation for many other genres, such as roguelikes, action adventures, and CRPGs. Another important innovation of Colossal Cave that is often overlooked by historians was the first ever cheat code in video games. The magical word ZZ was added at the request of Will Crowder's sister. She was testing the game and wanted to avoid replaying some of its early sections again. This cheat code was later included in countless games and utilities as a tribute to Colossal Cave Adventure, and 45 years later, its legacy continues to live on. Just when I began doing my research about this game, the news broke out that we are going to get its remake very soon. And it's being made by none other than Ken and Roberto Williams, one of the leading figures of the computer gaming industry of the 80s. We are going to note some of their early contributions to the history in the final chapters of this episode. By the late 70s, the situation in the computer world was rather interesting. The mainframe gaming scene had reached its peak, but the home computer market had not yet taken off. Those two worlds were slowly colliding with each other, but the connections between them were not fully established yet. For that reason, it wasn't uncommon for different developers to come up with the same ideas around the same time without knowing about each other's work. But being first meant little if you weren't lucky with reaching the right audience for your game, and the coverage of the market remained to be a major problem for commercial software developers for quite some time. One of the prime examples of such cases is the history of one of the fundamental subgenres of computer RPGs, roguelike. This term is derived from Rogue, a game inspired by Colossal Cave Adventure and developed by Michael Toy and Glenn Wichman in 1980. It became widely popular and was eventually ported from mainframes on every relevant home computer of the 80s. But Rogue wasn't the first one to introduce players to the core gameplay elements of the genre, such as procedurally generated levels and permadeath mechanics. There was also a game called Beneath Apple Manor, written by Don Worth for Apple II, which predates Rogue by almost 2 years, and yet it went mostly unnoticed by the public at the time. So how come we are not playing BAM-like games nowadays instead of roguelikes? The answer to that mystery is not rocket science. At its initial release in 1978, Beneath Apple Manor was available only on a platform that sold around 7,000 units by date. It was a commercial product for a tiny market, packaged and sold mainly by Don Worth himself through local stores and mail orders. On the other hand, despite being 2 years late, Rogue was freely distributed within a large community of mainframe users. So, as you can see, the success of the computer game back then depended on many factors, and in the bigger picture, it was largely a matter of luck. There are probably more stories similar to the fate of Beneath Apple Manor, but we might never know about them.
What you find when you look into the history of all these things is that people just basically do the best they can with the things they have available at the time. So a lot of things are just accidents caused by particular circumstances that in hindsight look like, oh, we were so incredibly smart to figure out that this was the way to do it. When in reality, it's not that way at all. What happens is people just try out different stuff, but you, looking at it 30 or 40 years later, you only hear about the stuff that worked.
Yeah.
Okay. And you only talk to the people like me who got like incredibly lucky that this goofy thing that we decided to do, which we never expected would, you know, maybe we might pay back our college loans.
While the majority of game developers of that era were usually coming from computer enthusiast groups, there were many people who weren't involved in those communities before they ventured into the software industry. The story of Doc Carlston is one of such examples. Before getting into game development, he worked as an attorney. At some point, he bought TRS-80 to improve his productivity at work. But the effect was exactly the opposite, as Carlston used his new computer to make a game for his own leisure. Surprisingly, what he came up with was not a simple copy of known gameplay concepts. Instead, Galactic Empire was perhaps the first ever 4X strategy game, predating Master of Orion for over a decade. Initially, Carlston didn't have any plans on seriously getting into the software development business. Being short on money, he sent his game to a few available publishers to compensate for the time he wasted on making it, But this fun little hack ended up being so commercially successful that within a few months he abandoned practicing law to fully focus on his new passion. Together with his brother, in 1980, Carlston co-founded Broderbund, the company that would become one of the biggest software publishers of the 80s. Another notorious label that was established by people who weren't related to the mainframe gaming scene was Epyx. It was formed by avid Dungeons & Dragons players John Freeman and Jim Connolly. In case you didn't know, D&D is a tabletop role-playing game that became a cultural phenomenon in its own right. Epyx made their debut on the market in 1978 with Starfleet Orion, a simplistic space strategy game for 2 players. But the true major success came to the company the following year with the release of Temple of Apshai, the first graphical role-playing game for home computers. It was one of the early blockbusters of the industry that stayed in bestseller charts for several years straight. Temple of Apshai spawned a franchise that comprised almost a dozen games and appeared on most home computers of that era. Unfortunately, the original Temple of Apshai is not particularly playable today, and judging by user reviews, the remake that is available on Steam is riddled with critical bugs. Still, the historic value of this game cannot be underestimated, and it won't be the last time you'll hear about Epyx in this documentary series either. The last but not the least company that I want to mention in this chapter is Strategic Simulations Incorporated, better known as SSI. Established by Joe Billings in 1979, its founding product was Computer Bismarck, the first commercially published wargame on Micros. The company would later become notorious for its high-quality wargames and the line of official computer game adaptations of Dungeons & Dragons. SSI was one of the many pioneers that managed to find their niche and helped to build this new industry. Most of these companies and games are largely unknown by the wide audience nowadays, but it doesn't make their contribution less significant. It was a very diverse industry with no established rules and practices, created by people from completely different communities, but united with the same goal: to create games that would be enjoyed by thousands of players around the world. The audience was still not quite there, but it was an important step to PC gaming as we know it today. And in conclusion to this episode, we are going to take a closer look at 3 adventure games that made a huge impact on this burgeoning industry. Their creators were directly influenced by the brilliance of Colossal Cave Adventure and set themselves the goal of bringing a similar experience to Micros. And thanks to their efforts, adventures became one of the dominant genres in the early days of computer gaming. Before computers finally arrived at homes, there weren't many options available for people who wanted to build their career as a programmer. You could either become a scientist, do some stuff for the military, or find a job in a big electronics manufacturing company. It wasn't different for Scott Adams, a young computer enthusiast who's in the early 70s just graduated from Florida Institute of Technology. With his degree in system engineering, he easily took programming positions with the US Navy and then Stromberg Carlson Corporation. But gaming has always been one of his biggest passions, and Scott never missed a chance to write and play games on every hardware he had access to.
So for me, it was always natural. If I got a computer, I was going to do games on it. As a child, I loved games and I never outgrew that love.
At first, it was nothing more than just a fun hobby, but it all changed when one day someone brought a game that almost paralyzed the work of Scott's department.
I was working as a programmer at Stromberg Carlson in Lake Mary, Florida, and we had basically terminals to the mainframe, all the programmers that were working there, and then the IT department was separate where the mainframe sat. And somebody mentioned, hey, they're playing a game there, you might be interested.
As you may have already guessed, this game was one of the modified versions of Colossal Cave Adventure. Like so many other computer enthusiasts of that era, Adams was instantly captivated by this game and couldn't stop playing it for weeks. By the time he solved all the puzzles and got a perfect score, Scott began to fancy the idea of creating his own adventure. But instead of using the company's mainframe, Adams wanted to write it on a TRS-80 that he recently bought. Considering that his own computer had only 16K memory, this idea was predictably met with a lot of skepticism.
And I remember finally beating it, getting through to the end and saying, wow, I'm so sad it's over, but that was so much fun. And I told everybody in the office, or my colleagues there, I'm going to do something like that on my TRS-80. And they laughed. They said, that's impossible. You have a toy computer. This thing's running on a mainframe. You don't have anywhere near the memory or the processing power to do anything like that. And for me, that was, okay, well, let me give it a try.
Despite all the doubters, Adams took up the challenge and masterfully solved it within just around 2 weeks. The result of his efforts was Adventureland, the first commercial adventure game ever released on home computers. Despite the lack of any graphics, this game was a remarkable technical achievement for its time. To put things into perspective, if you wanted to get a microcomputer with the same amount of memory as an average mainframe of that era, you needed to buy thousands of TRS-80s and duct tape them together. Do not actually try to do this. It's just a silly analogy, so don't blame me when it won't work. Anyway, from a modern perspective, it might be hard to see anything special about this game. Adventureland was closely following the spirit of its progenitor and offered a similar premise of looking for different treasures hidden around the levels. Just like in Colossal Cave Adventure, all interactions are handled through the use of typed commands that comprise 1 or 2 words. Due to the memory constraints, the writing in Adventureland is rather simplistic and straightforward. It's a pure text adventure without any fancy features like an in-game map or at least some kind of hint system, so navigation in Adventureland can be quite frustrating for a modern gamer, especially if you won't make any notes during your playthrough. There isn't much else to say about this artifact from the past. Adventureland was fun in its own way, but didn't offer any significant gameplay innovations. But this game was the first of its kind on microcomputers and introduced the genre to the people who had no access to mainframes. And more importantly, back in the 70s, it showed that creating that kind of software could become a profitable business. Within a few years, there were dozens of new companies that were selling their own adventures and other games for home computers. At some point, even Microsoft made their own version of Colossal Cave Adventure for TRS-80 and Apple II. And looking slightly ahead, this remake would also become one of their launch titles for IBM PC. But let's return back to Adventureland. Once Adams had placed ads in computer magazines, his game immediately became a smashing success. Seeing an opportunity to work on something he enjoys, Scott decided to abandon his position in Stromberg Carlson. Together with his wife Alexis, he later established Adventure International, one of the first major computer gaming publishers in the world. Within just a few years, Adams created a whole dozen of adventure games and expanded his business to publishing works of other developers. The publishing arm of the company wasn't part of the initial plan. It happened naturally as more people discovered products of Adventure International.
I remember that because Doug Carlson approached us. He sent us a game called Galactic Empire and said, I played your games, I loved it, I wrote a game, do you want to do something with it? And it was like, well, let's take a look. And we talked about it and thought, well, yeah, why not? Why do we have to restrict ourselves to just our own game?
Along with the co-founder of Bruderband, Adams helped to kickstart the career of many other game developers of that era. Being true to their name, Adventure International soon gave a publishing license on their products to other companies around the globe. One of those subsidiaries was located in the UK and handled the distribution in the European market, It would later become an independent developer and create Simon the Sorcerer, one of the most beloved point-and-click adventures of the 90s. At some point, Adventure International games were even licensed to be published in Japan. This is not a well-known fact, so I was surprised to learn about it during my interview with Scott.
They came over and visited me with a proposal for the NEC computer. They wanted to take my games and put it on the NEC, which was a color computer, incredibly gorgeous, absolutely. I got to see the finished products. I have no idea if anyone ever really bought it. I don't know how the game played, but I have to say it looked incredible.
As you can see, Adventure International was a pretty big deal back then. Hardware manufacturers quickly realized the potential of the gaming market, so they often contacted Adams to make sure that he would put his products on their upcoming computers.
So then Commodore called our company, talked first to staff, who then passed it on to me. And basically they said, we want to put your games on our machine, on the VIC-20. I thought, okay, sounds good. So we worked out the agreement. And they said, also what we'll do is we're going to send engineers to help you do the conversion to this platform. And that they did. And I remember us getting down, there was 3 different engineers that would come down. Different times. They actually lived with me at our house with my wife and kids while they were working on this, and we spent day and night working on it.
Just think about it for a minute. Back in the early days of the home computer market, having adventure games in your software library was as important as having sports simulators and GTA on your machine these days. How times have changed, haven't they? Anyway, the interest in computer gaming was growing exponentially, and at some point it was noticed by no less than Marvel themselves. And back then, everyone knew that if you wanted to be successful on computers, you had to make an adventure game. So there is no surprise here that Marvel approached one of the most well-known developers in this field.
They said, well, we're hearing about these home computers, and I want to expand Marvel into the home computers. And I asked around, who should we talk to about doing this? He said, everybody I talked to said, see Scott Adams, Adventure International. What an honor. So what we worked out was an incredible deal that I don't think they've ever done since for any other publisher. But basically, I had full rights and ability to do whatever I wanted, other than they would vet the art. Make sure the art fit and that we weren't going outside of any boundaries. So I could write the games any way I wanted, full artistic license. And it turns out that they would generate a series of comics to go with the game. They would do cross tie-in promotion in their comics. I could then write the comics. I wrote the outlines for the comics, and they did the full story blow-up and the inking and coloring. They used some of their best artists and writers at the time, which was really amazing, and I got to meet them.
For several years, Adventure International continued its rapid expansion on the home computer market, but the industry was changing even faster. The competition was increasing, and there was a noticeable shift towards more graphically advanced games. In the attempt to catch up with the new trends, Adams tried to modernize his old adventures by adding graphics to them. Or, to describe it better, a bunch of simple illustrations that didn't affect the core gameplay at all. This initiative failed to turn the tides, and Adventure International went bankrupt in the mid-80s. The lack of technical advancements in their games was not the only reason why the company met its unfortunate fate. Adventure International was one of the victims of a major crisis that hit the computer industry in the mid-80s. But that's the topic for another episode. As for Scott Adams, thankfully it was not the end of his game dev career. After taking a break for a few decades, he returned to game development and recently worked on several new projects. And one of them is Adventureland XL, an enhanced remake of the original game from 1978.
It was supposed to be a quick little salute. The XL is a double meaning. It is XL for extra large. It has the original Adventureland game in there. Just about everything plays the same way, except it's full sentence instead of 2 words. The XL section is a whole new section. Once you complete the original game, you get to find out what the XL is about. And it also is the Roman numerals, XL, for the Roman numeral 40. And it was the 40th anniversary that we were releasing this on.
In its current state, Adventureland XL is playable from end to end except for additional levels that weren't in the original game. Development team also works on adding accessibility features, like the mode for blind people. So if you want to give a try to one of the first computer games ever made, I put the link to the remake's Steam page in the description of this video. Adventureland wasn't the most innovative game in its genre, but it proved that such an experience was possible on Micros. Thanks to the initial success of Adventure International, selling games on computers was no longer seen as something crazy, but as a viable business idea. Scott Adams led by example and helped to propel the growth of this new market. So although Adventure International is not as well known today as the next 2 companies that we are going to discuss, its efforts in the early days of computer gaming deserves to be noted in our PC Gaming Chronicles. As the decade was coming to an end, Colossal Cave Adventure continued to spread like wildfire. One of the many victims who has fallen under the spell of this game was Roberto Williams. But unlike the majority of pioneers of the computer gaming industry, Roberta didn't have any programming background. In the late 70s, she was a housewife with 2 kids, married to a young but ambitious programmer, Ken Williams. At that time, none of the Williamses even thought about getting into the game dev industry. Although Ken sought to start his own computer software company, he was aiming for an enterprise market. On the other hand, Roberta was busy with taking care of their sons and dealing with the household chores. But it all changed when Ken brought home a terminal that was connected via telephone lines to the mainframe of one of his clients. As it happened, this mainframe had a copy of Colossal Cave Adventure, but unlike many computer enthusiasts of that era, Ken managed to resist its charms. Still, he decided to show this digital curiosity to his wife, since she always loved reading fairy tales and fantasy books. But what happened next was not something that Ken or anyone else could have expected. His dutiful wife, who never really cared about computers, suddenly became an avid gamer. Roberta experienced the same symptoms of the adventure fever as everyone else. For several weeks, she became transfixed by the game and couldn't think about anything else. Obsessed with getting a perfect score, Roberta was drawing maps and working through the puzzles in her mind, even when she wasn't playing Colossal Cave. Once the goal was achieved, Roberta quickly realized that she wanted to play more games like this. Around that time, Ken brought home an Apple II, which he planned to use to make his way to the top of the business software industry. But his plans were soon interrupted when Roberta began to use their new computer to play every adventure game that she could find, which included most of the Adventure International products, by the way. To her disappointment, back then there weren't many adventures available on the market. After all, it was the late 70s, so the computer gaming industry was still in its infancy. And that's how Roberta started daydreaming about making her own adventure game.
Basically, the essential idea of how I design and how I think of a game is not really changed from Mystery House, the first game I did. The basic elements are still there.
Inspired by Agatha Christie's novel And Then There Were None, Roberta designed a murder mystery game with a non-linear structure. The player finds himself with a group of other adventurers and has to look for valuable jewels that were hidden somewhere in the old mansion. But soon after the search begins, the dead bodies of your companions begin to appear all over the house. There is a killer on the loose, and you have to reveal their identity before you'll become the next victim. This element of investigation added suspense that was unusual for adventure games of that era. The concept of a future game was shaping up nicely, but there was a little problem. Roberta had only a slight idea on how to turn her characters and sketches into a code that would be recognized by a computer. So to bring her vision to life, Roberta decided to talk her husband into helping her. After all, he knew how to deal with computers much better than she did. When Roberta approached him, Ken was still busy with his own project. But when he saw how passionate his wife was about the game she imagined, Ken agreed to help make it happen.
We did all the work ourselves. I wrote the game from a scripting standpoint. I did the dialogue, I did the art. My husband did the programming. He would take my art, put it into the game, and my scripting, and put it into the game, and he programmed it.
Instead of just doing the bare minimum to quickly return to his own work, as a good husband, Ken took this new project seriously. Along with the programming, together with Roberta, he was brainstorming ideas on how to make their game stand out. And at some point, the Williamses hit upon an idea. Why not to use the graphics capabilities of Apple II to accompany the text with images? Ken looked into the matter and quickly found a way to digitize hand-drawn illustrations and add them to the game. And thus a Mystery House was made, the first ever graphical adventure game. It's important to note that the graphics were not something previously unseen in the gaming industry, even on home computers. Mystery House wasn't even the prettiest game around here. It had only around 70 simplistic 2D images with no color or animations, but for the adventure genre it was a major breakthrough, and not just in terms of visuals, but the gameplay as well. Even when developers like Scott Adams began to add graphics to their text adventures, those enhancements still served no real purpose, except for the questionable visual appeal. But in Mystery House, the graphics were a crucial part of the experience. Despite the lack of animations, each scene was given important information to the player and visually changed depending on his actions. Let's take a look at this example. When you open the cabinet, you can see inside a box of matches. Then you write a command to take those matches, and on the next screen they are gone. It might sound silly today, but back then such interactivity was a remarkable achievement for the genre. While Mystery House deserves to be praised for its innovations, I feel that it's important to note that it wasn't a perfect game. Perhaps the biggest downside of Mystery House is its very primitive parser. Its limited vocabulary often struggles to understand your commands and causes a lot of frustration. The confusion begins right from the start. You find yourself in the front of the house with a wide porch. It's obvious that you need to enter this house, but how are you supposed to do such a basic action? Commands like go house or go porch are not working, and the game also doesn't understand you if you try to move in its direction, which is, judging by visuals, supposed to be in the north. Maybe it's because I'm not a native English speaker, but I stuck on this first screen for a good 5 minutes before I finally wrote go steps, and it worked. Such inconsistency goes through the whole game. It doesn't understand you when you shorten the word butter knife to just knife, but accept it when you write fridge instead of refrigerator. Another example is that thing that looked like a jar to me, but apparently it's a pitcher. I swear, this game is just making fun of my poor English skills. It's strange because I didn't experience such issues when I was playing adventures that were purely text only. Anyway, such a guessing game with unacceptable syntax wouldn't have been a big deal. But Mystery House has a few scenes where you have to act quickly or you'll die. And if you'll write a command that the game won't understand, it still counts as a single turn. And in most cases, it's exactly how much time you have to resolve the puzzle. Well, at least there are no unwinnable states, so to beat the game, it's enough to just save often. Despite all the unfortunate downsides of Mystery House that make it hard to enjoy nowadays, it became an instant hit on its release back in May 1980. The game was published under the Online Systems label, a name that didn't really fit their first product. But it was a company that Ken established when he still had plans for publishing business applications, and that's why it was decided to temporarily repurpose the Online Systems brand for Mystery House release. The idea was to sell a few thousand copies over a few years, but the game beat all expectations and ended up selling over 15,000 units just in several months. It was a massive figure for the computer industry back then, and Williamses were totally unprepared for such a smashing success. After enduring the flood of phone calls from people who wanted to buy Mystery House, Ken and Roberta thought about their next move. It was clear that game development wasn't just a fun hobby, and it required their full attention. So they decided to pull up stakes and leased the first Online Systems office in a town near Los Angeles. Within a few months, they came out with a whole line of high-res graphical adventures. Their business was soon extended to publishing games of other developers, and it worked out excellent as well. Realizing the enormous potential of this venture, Ken set himself an ambitious goal to get to the top of this new industry.
And Sierra's goal has always been to be the leader in interactive entertainment and to prove to the world that this truly is a different medium, not just movies with a computer or something. It's different. It's suddenly make the player kind of the master of the world, make them own all those pixels on that screen of that machine, and it's going to be an enormous industry, and we just want to own it.
The business was booming, but the real fame came to the company a few years later, after it was renamed to Sierra Online. Under this label, Ken and Roberta Williams created and published one of their most beloved games. But it was Mystery House that truly marked the birth of Sierra, a company that in many cases was ahead of its time and influenced computer gaming for decades to come. And you can be sure that it won't be the last time we'll talk about Sierra's legacy in this documentary series. As you can imagine, during the production of this episode, taking an interview with the founders of Sierra was one of my goals. Unfortunately, Ken and Roberta didn't have time to talk with me yet, because they are currently busy with the remake of Colossal Cave Adventure. This video already took way too much time to finish, so I couldn't wait any longer and had to publish it with what I had at the current moment. But this interview technically still on the table, though it's hard to make any promises considering the current situation here. Still, I hope it will happen someday, since I have a lot of things I wanted to ask Ken and Roberta about. Anyway, let's hope for the best and proceed to the final chapter of this episode. A story of the last but not the least influential game that I'm going to cover in this episode originates in 1977, when Colossal Cave Adventure arrived at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The results were predictable. For several weeks, every computer enthusiast at MIT was doing nothing but playing this game. Inspired by Colossal Cave, a group of ambitious students, which consisted Dave Lebling, Mark Blank, Tim Anderson and Bruce Daniels, believed they could create something even better. To give a name to their own little project, they took a nonsense word used around the hacker community at MIT that meant an unfinished program: Zork. Following the spirit of hacker culture, during its development, the game was freely available to everyone who could find it on ARPANET. Based on the feedback from enthusiastic players, the group continued to adjust the gameplay and adding new content. By the time when development reached its conclusion, Zork grew to almost 1 megabyte, an enormous size for its time. In 1979, the deed was done. Zork has surpassed Colossal Cave Adventure in every aspect. Just like most of the other adventures of the late 70s, the core gameplay of Zork was focused on a treasure hunt and puzzles. But what distinguished it from competitors was a remarkably sophisticated text parser. Unlike the most, if not all, adventure games of that era, Zork wasn't limited to the two-word commands and could recognize natural English language input. In terms of interactivity and quality of the writing, it brought the genre to a whole new level. Playing Zork was like being the protagonist of an exciting fantasy book that you were simultaneously helping to write. Despite being purely a text-only experience, the vivid imagery that this game could create in a player's imagination was easily outmatching anything that could have been done with computer graphics back then.
It was simply the most, kind of groundbreaking, technologically impressive, mind-boggling thing that you could do on a computer. Just to be able to speak to it, to enter, not speak to it, obviously you're typing, but to enter full English sentences and have it respond to you.
Born out of boredom, Zork wasn't supposed to become something more than just a little challenge. But as the microcomputer revolution has rapidly unfolded, hacker communities couldn't keep ignoring the potential of this new market. So in 1979, a group of staff and students of MIT decided to create a startup focused on developing commercial software for micros. But there was a little problem. Nobody knew what kind of product they wanted to make. So before everyone started brainstorming ideas, it was decided to take a nondescript company name that could have meant literally anything but still sounded like a big deal. And that's how Infocom was founded, an accidental empire of the early days of the computer gaming industry. A new company needed a product to sell, but they soon realized that the mass market had slightly different standards than the fellow hackers community. And to make a good software from scratch, the team required funding that was basically non-existent at the beginning. The solution was to take those little hacks that members of Infocom did for fun at MIT and quickly adapt them as a commercial product. And as it happened, 3 of the 4 creators of the original Zork were among the founders of Infocom. But the question was, how could you fit such a huge game into home computers of that era, most of which had only 16K memory on average? And so Joel Barris and Mark Blank came up with the idea of designing a virtual environment called Z-Machine that was specifically optimized to run Zork. Its code was written in a very compact language called ZIL, which stands for Zork Implementation Language.
And it was just amazing how much, the game was able to fit onto a floppy disk that held like 80 kilobytes. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think about how small that is. I mean, like the signature file that gets appended to every email that I send these days is like twice as big as that.
Later, this virtual machine would be repurposed and used in the development of almost every Infocom title that followed after. It was a very efficient and unusual solution for the gaming industry of that era, which made the code machine independent and allowed porting games to different computers relatively easy. At the same time, writing a ZIL code didn't require extensive programming knowledge from game designers.
Well, it was certainly a lot closer to code that was actually pretty readable. I certainly wasn't a programmer. I had that little bit of programming background at MIT, but not a lot of programming background. And yet I was able to pick it up really easily, as were all sorts of other Infocom game writers who didn't have, a big technical or programming background. I mean, you could really look at the code and, even with almost no training, kind of read it and figure out what was going on. It was quite high level.
Despite such a clever technical solution, squeezing the entire Zork within the constraints of early microcomputers remained to be an impossible task. So it was decided to split the original game into 2 parts. But it was still not enough, and later the franchise would transform into a trilogy. By the year 1980, a version of Zork for TRS-80 was deemed finished, and Infocom started to shop around for the publisher. they ended up making a deal with no less but the creators of VisiCalc, the first ever killer app in the computer industry. But due to lackluster support from the publisher, it was a short-lived cooperation, and so a year later, Infocom began to handle the distribution of their games independently. It proved to be the right decision, as the sales of Zork and its sequels were not dropping over time as it usually happened. Instead, the series continued to gain more and more popularity, dominating the best-selling charts for years to come. The tremendous success of their first game opened up many possibilities for Infocom. Games that followed shortly after were not limited to the fantasy genre and were covering a whole spectrum of fiction like crime, horror, sci-fi and others. But the one thing that never changed was the excellent quality of Infocom games, and soon the company gained an army of loyal fans. Another interesting feature that distinguished Infocom from competitors was the unique packaging of their games. The developers were constantly running up against limits of the early home computers, and to compensate for this issue, the team decided to keep some pieces of the game's lore in the form of physical props.
What really kind of changed it was deadline. So like all the Infocom games, as I said earlier, would always be running up against this limit of, 100-ish K size. And of course, Deadline had just, all those characters who were the suspects in the story. And so there was way more to the mystery than could fit within that 100 kilobyte program. And so sort of putting interviews and other clues into the package made it much more feasible to have a mystery of that scale, fitting on a floppy disk.
Infocom games included in their packaging all sorts of additional materials, such as maps, pamphlets and other stuff. Those props were also giving clues to the player and worked as protection against piracy in some way.
So yeah, certainly there were those sorts of things to try to build the the stuff you needed to play the game into the package elements, but also kind of a little less kind of direct, sort of bring down the hammer type anti-piracy, was just creating a feeling of you want to own the package. The package is just so cool and creates such a much more complete experience in terms of playing the game that regardless of, I need information that was in the package, is just I want to own the package. I don't want to pirate the game because it will not give me the complete experience.
In some cases, Infocom was going as far as creating stuff like plastic face masks or UFO-shaped containers, and it was not some collector's editions, but standard versions of their games. Such creative and lavish packaging was unprecedented for the industry back then, and it became an essential part of Infocom's brand image.
It's kind of interesting how that came about. So, sort of when Infocom got started, circa 79-80, the state of the art for software being sold in stores was just a Ziploc bag. You'd have a disk and a manual, sometimes manual that was just nothing more than a few Xerox pages, stuck in a Ziploc bag that would then, have a little hole in it and hang on a hook in the store. And so even the early Infocom packages, Zork 1 and Zork 2 and Zork 3, which are relatively uninteresting compared to the later Infocom packages, those blister packs still represented a significant step up from the state of the art at that time.
The development story of Zork is a good reflection of the computer gaming industry at its beginning. Started out as an innocent fun of bored students, Zork brought its creators at the top of the burgeoning industry that didn't even exist a few years ago. Infocom was one of the first to prove that computer games could be more than just a primitive toy for a bunch of geeks. Their products were getting coverage from mainstream outlets such as The Washington Post, Time, BBC and many others. Infocom was one of the brightest stars of this new industry, and every single game they made was bound to become a solid hit. And yet, the company never managed to surpass the success of Zork, which would remain to be their best-selling product until the very end. As the home computer market entered a new decade, everything indicated that it was heading towards the age of exponential growth and prosperity. The demand was rising, the technology was rapidly evolving, and more companies were joining the industry. New gaming experiences and genres were about to be invented, and manufacturers were getting ready to make their next move on the hardware market. It was an exciting time for computer enthusiasts, and things were only going to get more interesting from now on. But soon many pioneers of the computer industry would learn that the expression "may you live in interesting times" was a curse and not a blessing. You were watching PC Gaming Chronicles. I hope that you enjoyed this episode because it took quite a lot of effort to complete it. Do not hesitate to share your feedback so I can make this documentary series even better. And if you wish to learn more about the future of this project and how you can help to complete it faster, please watch the video linked on the end screen. But before you go, here's what you can expect to see in the next episode that will be focused on the year 1981. IBM introduces their first personal computer. Wizardry, the grandfather of role-playing video games. Castle Wolfenstein, the pioneer of stealth genre. Japanese home computers, a forgotten chapter of PC gaming history. Ultima, the open-world revolution. This and much more you'll see on the next edition of PC Gaming Chronicles. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more.